The sun cast long shadows across the rocky shores of Newfoundland as archaeologist Hel Jingstead carefully brushed dirt from what would become one of history's most significant discoveries. It was 1960, and the world still largely believed that Christopher Columbus had been the first European to set foot in the Americas. But beneath Ingsted's careful hands lay evidence that would shatter this centuries-old narrative forever. The story of America's discovery had always been more complex than textbooks suggested. For generations, schoolchildren learned that Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, landing in what is now the Bahamas and claiming the New World for Spain. This narrative, however, ignored crucial evidence that had been hiding in plain sight for centuries. Norse sagas, passed down through generations of Scandinavian storytellers, spoke of Viking expeditions to a land called Vinland the Good, centuries before Columbus was even born, as Ingstad worked at Lonso Meadows. He uncovered the remains of Norse buildings, complete with iron nails and other artifacts distinctly Scandinavian in origin. Carbon dating would later confirm what the sagas had long claimed. Vikings had established settlements in North America around 1000 CE, nearly 500 years before Columbus's famous voyage. The discovery sent shockwaves through the academic world, forcing historians to reconsider everything they thought they knew about European contact with the Americas. But the Vikings were not the only ones whose stories had been overlooked. Indigenous peoples had been living in the Americas for thousands of years before any Europeans set foot on the continent. Clovis people had crossed the Bering Land Bridge over 13,000 years ago, establishing complex civilizations that would flourish long before European contact. The ancestral Poblones built magnificent cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde in the 1200s, while the Mississippian culture constructed the massive earthen pyramids at Cahokia around 1050 CE. These civilizations had their own complex trade networks, sophisticated agricultural systems, and rich cultural traditions. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known as the Iroquois League, had developed a democratic system of government that would later influence the founding fathers of the United States. The Aztec Empire, centered in what is now Mexico, controlled vast territories and built one of the world's largest cities at Tenochtitlan. The Inca Empire stretched along the entire western coast of South America, connected by an intricate road system that rivaled anything built by the Romans. Yet these achievements were often dismissed or ignored by European chroniclers, who portrayed the Americas as an empty wilderness waiting to be claimed. This narrative served the interests of European colonizers, who used the concept of terra nullius, or empty land, to justify their territorial claims. The reality, however, was far different from this convenient fiction. The question of who discovered America reveals the problematic nature of the term itself. Can one truly discover a land that is already inhabited by millions of people? The very concept of discovery implies that the Americas were unknown before European contact, erasing the experiences and achievements of countless indigenous civilizations. This erasure would have profound consequences for how the history of the Americas was written and understood for centuries to come. As historians began to piece together this more complete picture, they realized that the story of Columbus was just one chapter in a much larger and more complex narrative of human migration and cultural exchange. Ericsson stood at the prow of his longship, scanning the horizon for signs of land. According to the Icelandic sagas, it was around 1000 CE when this Norse explorer first laid eyes on the coast of what would later be called North America. The wind filled the square sail of his vessel as he guided his crew toward a shoreline that promised timber, wild grapes, and fertile soil, resources that were precious commodities in the harsh landscape of Greenland. The Viking expansion westward had begun decades earlier when Eric the Red, Leif's father, established the first Norse settlements in Greenland. Around 985 CE, these hardy seafarers were driven by a combination of factors: overpopulation in Scandinavia, political conflicts that forced many into exile, and the constant search for new lands to farm and settle. Their advanced shipbuilding technology, particularly the design of their shallow draft longships, made them uniquely suited for exploration and settlement in uncharted waters. According to the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red Leif Erikson's voyage to Vinland was actually preceded by an accidental discovery. Bjarni Hergolfsson, blown off course while sailing to Greenland around 986 CE, reportedly sighted unknown lands to the west, but did not land. Description of these mysterious shores intrigued other Norse explorers, particularly Leif Erikson, who purchased Bjarni's ship and set out to investigate these western lands. Context drawn from archaeological findings. Published in National Geographic's Comprehensive Analysis of Norse Settlements in North America, the Norse expeditions to North America were not single voyages, but rather a series of exploration and settlement attempts spanning several decades. After Leif's initial voyage, his brother Thorvald Eriksson led another expedition around 1004 CE, but was killed in conflicts with indigenous peoples, whom the Norse called Skrallings. Despite this setback, the lure of Vinland's resources continued to attract Norse settlers. The most ambitious attempt at permanent settlement came around 1010 CE, when Thorfinn Karlsefni led an expedition of 160 men and women to establish a colony in Vinland. The settlers brought livestock, tools, and supplies for an extended stay, indicating their serious intention to create a permanent Norse presence in North America. For 3 years, they attempted to build a sustainable settlement, but ultimately abandoned the effort due to ongoing conflicts with indigenous peoples and the logistical challenges of maintaining supply lines across the North Atlantic. Archaeological evidence supports these saga accounts with remarkable precision. The excavations at Lanso Meadows revealed not just Norse buildings, but also evidence of iron smelting, woodworking, and other activities consistent with a settlement attempting to establish itself permanently. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials found at the site confirms occupation around 1000 CE, matching the time frame described in the sagas. The Norse settlements in North America represented a remarkable achievement in navigation and exploration. Using only primitive instruments and their knowledge of ocean currents, cooned patterns, and celestial navigation, these medieval seafarers successfully crossed one of the world's most dangerous stretches of ocean repeatedly. Their shallow draft, longships designed for both ocean voyaging and river navigation, allowed them to explore far inland along North American waterways. However, the Norse presence in North America ultimately proved unsustainable. The small population of Greenland, probably never more than 5,000 people at its peak, could not support large-scale colonization efforts across the Atlantic. The settlements were too far from Norse supply bases. Conflicts with indigenous peoples made permanent habitation dangerous. By 1050 CE, regular Norse voyages to North America had apparently ceased, though some contact may have continued sporadically for decades afterward. The failure of Norse colonization meant that their discovery of America had no lasting impact on European knowledge of the Western continent. Long before any European ship touched American shores, vast continents of North and South America teemed with sophisticated civilizations that had been developing for millennia. The story of America's true discovery begins not with European explorers, but with the first peoples who crossed the Bering Land Bridge during the last ice age, approximately 15,000 years ago. These early inhabitants, ancestors of all Native American peoples, embarked on one of humanity's greatest migrations. As glaciers locked up vast amounts of ocean water, sea levels dropped by as much as 400 feet, exposing a land bridge between Siberia and Alaska called Beringia. Small bands of hunter-gatherers following herds of mammoth, bison, and other megafauna knowingly became the first humans to set foot on the American continents. The Clovis culture, dating from approximately 13,500 years ago, represents one of the earliest widespread archaeological traditions in North America. Named after distinctive spear points first discovered near Clovis, New Mexico in 1932, these skilled hunters developed sophisticated tools and weapons that allowed them to hunt large game across vast territories. Their distinctive fluted projectile points have been found from Alaska to Central America, indicating a remarkably successful adaptation to diverse environments as millennia passed. These early inhabitants diversified into hundreds of distinct cultures, each adapted to their specific environment and developing unique traditions. languages, and forms of social organization. In the Pacific Northwest, peoples like the Tlingit and Haida developed complex maritime cultures, creating elaborate totem poles and practicing sophisticated resource management that sustained large populations for thousands of years. Their cedar plank houses and ocean-going canoes demonstrated advanced woodworking skills that rivaled anything found in Europe. The Great Plains witnessed the rise of buffalo hunting cultures that developed intricate relationships with the massive herds that roamed the grasslands. Before the introduction of horses by Europeans, these peoples conducted elaborate buffalo jumps, driving entire herds over cliffs in carefully coordinated hunts that required sophisticated knowledge of animal behavior and terrain. The surplus from these hunts supported complex trade networks that stretched from the Rocky Mountains to the Mississippi River in the eastern woodlands. Agricultural innovations led to the development of the Three Sisters farming technique, combining corn, beans, and squash in a sustainable agricultural system that enriched rather than depleted the soil. This agricultural revolution supported the rise of large settlements and complex political organizations, including the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, whose democratic principles would later influence European political thought. Archaeological evidence, referenced from Smithsonian Institution research on pre-Columbian civilizations, demonstrates the sophistication of these early American societies. The Mississippian culture, flourishing from approximately 800 to 1600 CE, constructed some of North America's most impressive pre-Columbian monuments. At Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis, they built a city that at its peak around 1050 CE housed between 10,000 and 20,000 people, making it larger than London at the time. The massive earthen pyramid at Cahokia, known as Monk's Mound, covers 14 acres at its base and rises 100 feet high, representing one of the largest prehistoric earthwork constructions in the Americas. These civilizations developed sophisticated astronomical knowledge, creating calendar systems and aligning their monuments with celestial events. The ancestral Puebloans built elaborate cliff dwellings at locations like Mesa Verde, while also constructing astronomical observatories that tracked the movements of the sun, moon, and stars with remarkable precision. Their understanding of solar and lunar cycles allowed them to develop accurate agricultural calendars essential for survival in the challenging environment of the American Southwest. The diversity of indigenous American civilizations rivaled that found anywhere in the world, from the Arctic peoples who developed ingenious technologies for surviving in one of Earth's harshest environments, to the tropical forest dwellers of the Amazon who created sustainable agricultural systems in one of the world's most biodiverse regions. Native American peoples demonstrated remarkable adaptability and innovation by the time Europeans began arriving in the Americas. Indigenous peoples had been shaping the landscape for thousands of years through controlled burning, selective harvesting, and sophisticated agricultural practices. The morning mist clung to the waters of the Atlantic. As Christopher Columbus stood on the deck of the Santa Maria, his weathered hands gripping the ship's rail, it was October 12, 1492, and after more than 2 months at sea, his lookout had finally spotted land. But Columbus was not discovering an unknown world. He was encountering civilizations that had flourished for thousands of years. Well, he would never fully grasp this reality. Columbus's voyage was the product of a unique convergence of European circumstances. The fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453 had disrupted traditional trade. Routes to Asia, making spices and silk increasingly expensive in European markets. Portuguese explorers had already begun seeking sea routes around Africa to reach the Indies. But Columbus believed he could find a shorter western route based on his miscalculations of Earth's circumference and the size of the Atlantic Ocean. The Italian-born navigator had spent years seeking financial backing for his ambitious plan. He approached the courts of Portugal, England, France, before finally convincing Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand of Spain to sponsor his expedition. The Spanish monarchs, fresh from their victory over Granada in January 1492, were eager to compete with Portuguese exploration efforts and spread Christianity to new lands, Columbus's first encounter with indigenous peoples occurred in the Bahamas, where he met the Taino people, whom he described in his journal as very well-formed people, with handsome bodies and handsome faces. However, his perspective was shaped entirely by European assumptions about civilization and religion. He immediately began assessing their potential as subjects of the Spanish crown and converts to Christianity, doubting that they ought to be faithful and intelligent servants, for I see that they repeat very quickly whatever we say to them. The Admiral's 4 voyages between 1492 and 1504 established permanent contact between Europe and the Americas. But his understanding of what he had accomplished remained fundamentally flawed until his death. Columbus died in 1506 still believing he had reached the Indies, never accepting that he had encountered an entirely separate continent. This geographical confusion would persist in European minds for years, with the new lands eventually being named after Amerigo Vespucci, who first recognized that these territories constituted a new world distinct from Asia. Historical documentation from Columbus's own journal entries, as preserved in Bartolomé de las Casas's transcription, provides insight into European perspectives on initial contact. The immediate consequences of Columbus's voyages were catastrophic for indigenous peoples. European diseases, to which Native Americans had no immunity, devastated populations across the Caribbean. The Taino people, who may have numbered as many as 1 million when Columbus first arrived, were reduced to perhaps 50,000 within 2 decades. Smallpox, typhus, and other diseases spread far ahead of European colonizers, creating a demographic catastrophe that fundamentally altered the balance of power between indigenous peoples and European newcomers. Columbus's establishment of the encomienda system on Hispaniola marked the beginning of systematic European exploitation of indigenous labor and resources. Under this system, Spanish colonists were granted control over indigenous communities, ostensibly to provide protection and Christian instruction in exchange for labor and tribute. In practice, the encomienda became a form of slavery that worked thousands of indigenous people to death in gold mines and sugar plantations. The economic implications of Columbus's voyages extended far beyond the Caribbean. The introduction of American crops like maize, potatoes, and tomatoes would eventually transform European agriculture and demographics. The influx of precious metals from American mines would reshape the global economy, fueling European expansion while simultaneously causing inflation that destabilized existing economic systems. Columbus's voyages also initiated the African slave trade to the Americas. Indigenous populations declined due to disease and overwork. European colonizers began importing enslaved Africans to provide labor for their expanding plantation economies. This tragic development would ultimately bring millions of Africans to the Americas against their will, creating another layer of cultural complexity in the New World. The legacy of Columbus remains deeply contested. While his voyages undeniably changed the course of world history, they also initiated centuries of colonization, cultural destruction, and exploitation that continue to impact indigenous peoples. Today, the news of Columbus's discoveries spread across Europe like wildfire, igniting an age of exploration that would reshape the world's political and economic landscape. Within decades of his return, European powers were launching expeditions across the globe, each seeking to claim their share of the riches and territories that the New World promised to deliver. Portugal, already experienced in oceanic exploration, quickly moved to secure its claims in the Americas. Pedro Alvarez Cabral, while sailing to India in 1500, was blown westward and accidentally discovered Brazil, immediately claiming it for the Portuguese crown. This discovery led to heated disputes between Spain and Portugal over territorial rights in the Americas, ultimately resolved by the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, which divided the undiscovered world between the two Iberian powers. The treaty demonstrated the breathtaking arrogance of European assumptions about their right to claim inhabited lands. Indigenous peoples were never consulted about this division of their territories, and the document treated vast continents containing millions of people as empty spaces to be allocated between European monarchs. The line drawn by the treaty, approximately 46 degrees 37 minutes west longitude, determined that Brazil would become Portuguese, while the rest of South America would fall under Spanish control. France entered the competition for American territories. Under King Francis I, who reportedly asked to see the clause in Adam's will that granted Spain and Portugal exclusive rights to the New World, French explorers like Jacques Cartier began exploring the St. Lawrence River Valley in 1534, establishing the foundation for what would become New France. The French approach to colonization differed significantly from Spanish methods, emphasizing trade relationships with indigenous peoples rather than territorial conquest and settlement. Giovanni de Verrazzano, sailing under the French flag in 1524, explored the North American coast from South Carolina to Newfoundland. It's becoming the first European to enter New York Harbor and Narragansett Bay. His detailed descriptions of the coastline and indigenous peoples provided Europeans with their first comprehensive view of North America's eastern seaboard. Verrazzano's encounters with indigenous peoples were generally peaceful, as his primary mission was exploration and mapping rather than conquest. Contemporary accounts from French and Spanish exploration records, as documented in the American Historical Review, reveal the varying European approaches to American colonization. England's entry into American exploration came later, but would ultimately prove most consequential for North American development. John Cabot's voyage in 1497, sailing from Bristol, reached the North American coast and claimed it for England. Though his exact landing site remains disputed among historians, these early English claims would later provide legal justification for extensive British colonization efforts along the Atlantic coast. The Spanish conquistadors represented perhaps the most dramatic phase of European expansion into the Americas. Hernán Cortes's conquest of the Aztec Empire between 1519 and 1521 demonstrated to Europeans that the Americas contained civilizations of enormous wealth and sophistication. With fewer than 600 men, Cortes managed to topple an empire of millions, primarily through strategic alliances with indigenous enemies of the Aztecs and the devastating impact of European diseases. Francisco Pizarro's conquest of the Inca Empire in the 1530s followed a similar pattern, the small force of Spanish conquistadors destroying one of the world's largest empires. The wealth extracted from the Inca territories, particularly the silver mines of Potosi, would fund Spanish imperial ambitions for centuries, while simultaneously devastating indigenous populations through forced labor and mercury poisoning. These conquests reveal the sophisticated nature of pre-Columbian American civilizations to European observers. The Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan amazed Spanish conquistadors with its size, organization, and architectural achievements. Built on an island in Lake Texcoco, the city housed approximately 200,000 people and featured elaborate causeways, floating gardens, and monumental temples that rivaled anything in Europe. The technological and biological advantages that enabled European conquest were not evidence of superior civilization, but rather the result of different historical circumstances. Europeans had developed gunpowder weapons, steel tools, and horses through their connections to Asian and African trade networks. More crucially, their long exposure to domestic animals had given them immunity to diseases that proved catastrophic for indigenous American populations. The age of exploration initiated by Columbus's voyages fundamentally altered global patterns of trade, settlement, and cultural exchange. European expansion into the Americas created the first truly global economy, connecting previously isolated continents through networks of trade and migration that continue to shape our world today. The encounter between the old and new worlds initiated an unprecedented exchange of plants, animals, diseases, and cultures that historian Alfred W. Crosby termed the Columbian Exchange. This biological and cultural transfer would prove more significant than any military conquest, fundamentally altering life on both sides of the Atlantic and reshaping human civilization itself. The agricultural revolution that followed Columbus's voyages may represent the most important consequence of European contact with the Americas. American crops like maize, potatoes, sweet potatoes, and cassava would eventually support population explosions across Europe, Africa, and Asia. The potato alone would transform European agriculture, providing a reliable, nutritious crop that could feed more people per acre than traditional European grains. Ireland's population doubled between 1750 and 1840 largely due to potato cultivation, though this dependence would later prove catastrophic during the Irish potato famine. Maize became equally transformative in Africa and Asia, where it provided a drought-resistant crop that could grow in marginal lands unsuitable for traditional grains. Chinese farmers adopted American crops so successfully that China's population tripled between 1600 and 1850, fundamentally altering the demographic balance of the world's most populous nation. The global impact of American crops was so profound that by 1800 these plants were feeding more people outside the Americas than within them. The exchange flowed in the opposite direction as well, with European livestock and crops transforming American landscapes and indigenous ways of life. Horses introduced by Spanish colonizers revolutionized plains, Indian cultures, enabling new forms of hunting, warfare, and social organization. The Comanche, Lakota, and other plains peoples became renowned for their horsemanship skills, developing military tactics that would challenge European colonizers for centuries. Cattle, pigs, and sheep transformed American ecosystems, sometimes displacing indigenous plants and animals. European weeds, carried accidentally in ship ballast and cargo, spread across American landscapes with remarkable speed. Dandelions, plantains, and other European plants became so common that indigenous peoples began calling them white man's footprints. Marking the advance of European settlement, environmental historian Alfred W. Crosby's groundbreaking research is published in Ecological Imperialism. It documents the profound biological consequences of European expansion. The most tragic aspect of the Columbian Exchange was the transmission of diseases that devastated indigenous American populations. Smallpox, measles, typhus, and other epidemic diseases, to which Europeans had developed partial immunity through centuries of exposure, proved catastrophic for peoples who had been isolated from Old World disease pools. Some scholars estimate that disease killed 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas within a century of first contact, representing one of the largest demographic catastrophes in human history. This demographic collapse had profound consequences for the development of colonial America. The devastation of indigenous populations created a labor shortage that Europeans initially tried to fill through indentured servitude and eventually through the enslavement of Africans. The Atlantic slave trade, which brought approximately 12.5 million Africans to the Americas between 1500 and 1860, was directly connected to the demographic catastrophe caused by European diseases. The cultural exchange was equally significant, though often overlooked in traditional historical accounts. Indigenous American knowledge of local environments, agricultural techniques, and medicinal plants proved essential for European survival and success. Native Americans taught Europeans how to cultivate American crops, navigate American rivers, and survive in unfamiliar climates. Without this indigenous knowledge, European colonization would have failed repeatedly. Indigenous peoples also adopted and adapted European technologies, creating hybrid cultures that combined old and new world elements. Native American peoples became skilled metal workers, incorporating European iron and steel into traditional tools and weapons. They adopted European textiles while maintaining traditional clothing styles, creating distinctive cultural blends that reflected their adaptive capabilities. The exchange of ideas and technologies flowed both directions, with European political thought being influenced by observations of indigenous American societies. The democratic principles of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, with its emphasis on representative government and individual liberty, influenced European political philosophers and, eventually, the founders of the United States. The Columbian Exchange created the modern world's interconnected global economy, but at an enormous cost in human suffering and environmental destruction. The wealth extracted from the Americas funded European expansion and industrialization, while the demographic catastrophe suffered by indigenous peoples created the conditions for centuries of colonization and cultural suppression. Understanding. The Columbian Exchange reveals that Columbus's voyages initiated changes far more profound than the simple discovery of new lands. As the 21st century progressed, historians, archaeologists, and indigenous scholars began fundamentally challenging the traditional narrative of American discovery. The emergence of new archaeological evidence, the rise of indigenous voices in academic discourse, and a growing awareness of the limitations of European-centered historical perspectives combined to create a more complex and accurate understanding of American history. The excavation of Monteverde in Chile, beginning in the 1970s, revealed human habitation dating back over 14,000 years, predating the Clovis culture and suggesting that humans had been living in the Americas far longer than previously believed. This discovery, along with other archaeological sites across the Americas, demonstrated that indigenous peoples had not only discovered America first, but had been actively shaping its landscapes and ecosystems for millennia before any European contact. Indigenous scholars and communities began asserting their own historical narratives, challenging the colonial assumption that their ancestors were somehow less capable of discovery than European explorers. These voices emphasized that from indigenous perspectives, America was never lost and therefore never needed to be discovered. The land and its peoples had continuous histories stretching back thousands of years, with complex political, economic, and cultural systems that European accounts had systematically ignored or misrepresented. The quincentennial of Columbus's first voyage in 1992 became a focal point for these reevaluations. Rather than celebrating the discovery of America, many communities used the anniversary to commemorate indigenous resistance to colonization and to highlight the devastating consequences of European contact for Native American peoples. The phrase Columbus Day began giving way to Indigenous Peoples Day in numerous communities, reflecting a fundamental shift in how Americans understood their history. Archaeological discoveries continued to reshape understanding of pre-Columbian America. The revelation that the Amazon rainforest had been extensively managed by indigenous peoples, with sophisticated agricultural systems supporting large populations, challenged assumptions about indigenous environmental practices. Terra preta soils, created by indigenous farmers, remain more fertile than surrounding rainforest soils 500 years after their creation, demonstrating advanced ecological knowledge that modern science is still working to understand. Recent scholarship published in American Antiquity has revolutionized understanding of pre-Columbian American civilizations and their environmental management practices. The question, "Who discovered America?" began to seem not only historically inaccurate, but philosophically problematic. The concept of discovery implies that something was unknown before being found. But the Americas were home to millions of people with their own knowledge systems, geographical understanding, and exploration traditions. Viking and European contacts represented encounters between different knowledge systems. Rather than the revelation of unknown lands to the world, modern DNA analysis has revealed the complexity of human migration to the Americas, suggesting multiple waves of migration from Asia and possibly other continents over thousands of years. These discoveries have complicated simple narratives about American origins, while highlighting the sophistication of ancient navigation and exploration by peoples whose achievements had been systematically undervalued. The traditional Columbus narrative served specific political purposes in American society, providing a foundation myth for European colonization while marginalizing indigenous experiences and perspectives. Italian Americans, facing discrimination in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, embraced Columbus as a symbol of their contributions to American society. This politically motivated celebration of Columbus further embedded the discovery narrative in American culture, even as historical evidence increasingly contradicted its basic assumptions. Contemporary historians now emphasize that understanding American history requires acknowledging multiple perspectives and recognizing that different peoples had different relationships with American landscapes and societies. The story of European contact with America is important, but it represents one chapter in a much longer and more complex narrative of human habitation, exploration, and cultural development in the Americas. The rewriting of American discovery. Narratives reflects broader changes in historical methodology, including greater attention to archaeological evidence, indigenous perspectives, and environmental history. These changes have created a more accurate but also more complex understanding of American history, one that recognizes the achievements and perspectives of all peoples who contributed to the development of American civilizations, rather than asking who discovered America. Modern historians increasingly focus on understanding how different peoples encountered, understood, and shaped American landscapes over thousands of years. This approach provides a more complete and accurate foundation for understanding the complex societies that emerged from these long histories of human interaction with American environments. The true story of America's discovery belongs not to any single individual or people, but to the countless generations who explored, settled, and shaped these continents over thousands of years of human history.